Up next, I'll talk about the Great Migration, sometimes known as the Great Northward Migration or the Black Migration. It was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern United States to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West between 1910 and 1970. This is KRT, Critical Race Theory. It's not the one they teach in law schools, but the one banned in public schools. What started the Great Migration? Well, what didn't start it? 3,500 black folks were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Everything was segregated. There was indentured servitude, convict leasing, the spread of racist ideology, and a lack of social and economic opportunities. Now, that convict leasing was interesting. I call it the plantation to prison to plantation pipeline. See, they passed a law that if you didn't have a job, you could be arrested for vagrancy. So that's just about everybody, right? Once you were arrested, the prison would lease you out to the plantation owner. That's a slick deal, right? But then opportunity came knocking. Some factors pulled black migrants to the north, such as labor shortages in northern factories brought by World War I. That resulted in thousands of jobs in steel mills, railroads, meat packing plants, and the automobile industry. There were also labor agents sent by northern businessmen to recruit southern workers. Northern companies offered special incentives to encourage black workers to relocate, including free transportation and low-cost housing. When I moved around, I did get free transportation, but no low-cost housing. That sounds like a deal. During World War I, there was a decline in European immigrants, which caused northern factories to feel the impact of a low supply of workers. Around 1.2 million European immigrants arrived during 1914, while only 300,000 arrived the next year. The enlistment of workers into the military had also affected the labor supply. This created a wartime opportunity in the North for African Americans as the northern industry sought a new labor supply in the South. There were many advantages for northern jobs compared to southern jobs, including wages that could be double or more. Sharecropping, agricultural depression, the widespread infestation of the boll weevil, and flooding also convinced African Americans to move into the northern cities. The lack of political power, representation, and social opportunities due to a culture regulated by Jim Crow laws was also motivation to migrate northward. The change brought by the migration was amplified because the migrants, for the most part, moved to the then largest cities in the United States: New York, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Washington, D.C. This was at a time when cities had a central cultural, social, political, and economic influence over the United States. Once there, African Americans established influential communities of their own despite the loss of leaving their homes in the South and all the barriers faced by the migrants in their new homes. The migration was an act of individual and collective agency which changed the course of American history, a declaration of independence written by their actions. The Great Migration was one of the largest and most rapid mass internal movements in history, perhaps the greatest not caused by the immediate threat of execution or starvation. For black people, the migration meant leaving what had always been their economic and social base in America and finding a new one. As a result of the migration between 1910 and 1930, the African American population increased by about 40% in northern states. It was mostly in the major cities. The cities of Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Baltimore, and New York City. Tens of thousands of black workers were recruited for industrial jobs, such as positions related to the expansion of the Pennsylvania Railroad. But things started to get rough. Because changes were concentrated in cities, which had also attracted millions of new or recent European immigrants, tensions rose as the people competed for jobs and scarce housing. With the migration of African Americans northward and the mixing of white and black workers in factories, the tension was building, largely driven by white workers. The American Federation of Labor advocated the separation between European Americans and African Americans in the workplace. There were non-violent protests such as walkouts in protest of having blacks and whites working together. As tension was building due to advocating for segregation in the workplace, violence soon erupted. In 1917, the East St. Louis, Illinois riot, known for one of the bloodiest workplace riots, had between 40 and 200 killed and over 6,000 African Americans displaced from their homes. The NAACP responded to the violence with a march known as the Silent March. Over 10,000 African American men and women demonstrated in Harlem, New York. Conflicts continued post-World War I as African Americans continued to face conflicts and tension while the African American labor activism continued. In the late summer and fall of 1919, racial tensions became violent and came to be known as the Red Summer. I covered this in my last video, the Red Summer Massacre, so go check it out when you get a chance. This period of time was defined by violence and prolonged rioting between black and white Americans in major United States cities. The race riots peaked in Chicago, with the most violence and death occurring there during the riots. By the time the rioting and violence had subsided in Chicago, 38 people had lost their lives, with 500 more injured. Racial violence appeared again in Chicago in the 1940s and in Detroit, as well as other cities in the Northeast, as racial tensions over housing and employment discrimination grew. The Great Depression wiped out job opportunities in the northern industrial belt, especially for African Americans, and caused a sharp reduction in migration. In the 1930s and 1940s, increasing mechanization of agriculture virtually brought the institution of sharecropping that had existed since the Civil War to an end in the United States. That had caused many landless black farmers to be forced off the land. So approximately 1.4 million Southerners moved north or west in the 1940s, followed by 1.1 million in the 1950s and another 2.4 million in the 1960s and early 70s. By the late 1970s, as deindustrialization and the Rust Belt crisis took hold, the Great Migration came to an end. But in a reflection of changing economics, as well as the end of Jim Crow laws in the 1960s and improved race relations in the South, in the 1980s and early 1990s, more black Americans were heading south than leaving the region. In pop culture, the Great Migration was a backdrop of the 2013 film The Butler, where the Forrest Whitaker character, Cecil Gaines, moves from a plantation in Georgia to become a butler at the White House. The Great Migration also served as part of August Wilson's inspiration for the piano lesson. This has been Critical Race Theory. Thanks for checking in. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. I'll see you next time.